All right, everybody, we are streaming here on Facebook and letting everybody into our Zoom room. So if you'll just bear with us for a few moments, we want to make sure we get everybody a chance to get in here before we begin our introduction. So just bear with us for just a few moments. We'll get started. All right. Hey, everybody. This is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. Hello out there in Facebook world and Zoom world and everywhere else for watching. So glad to have you all here. For our virtual author series, which we have been doing since April. We've been doing 2 or 3 author events a week since then. We've done, I think, over 80 events since COVID era began. And it's been really great to stay in contact with all of you, our readers, and meet new people and kind of even get the opportunity to extend beyond our boundaries of Tulsa or Oklahoma and have people watching from around the country and in some cases around the world. So thank you for staying connected with us and supporting local bookstores and indie bookstores. We're a little bit unique in the fact that we're a nonprofit bookstore, but we have the same needs and functions as most indie bookstores. And it's been pretty humbling and amazing to see you guys support us. In many ways, it's not just a sense of survival that we've had, but we've thrived in many ways because you guys have come out and shown up and bought curbside books and bought online books. And when we reopened, kept the kind of capacity down. You were okay standing in line outside waiting to get in and wearing your masks and doing all the things you needed to do. So thank you so much for doing that. We're getting into the holiday season. Somebody asked me yesterday, if I'm worried about the traffic and what the holidays are going to be like in 2020. And I think actually there's going to be a real big need for people to kind of keep their money in their towns and their cities and buy more local than they've ever maybe done before during the holidays. So I hope that's the case. And I hope you will think about doing that with us. So thanks for that. We have a bunch of cool things still coming up the rest of the year. This Thursday, we're going to be talking with author Matt Ruff, who you may or may not know that name, but he wrote the novel Lovecraft Country, which was made into the most recent hit HBO show. And one of the episodes of Lovecraft Country, if you saw the show, is a recreation of the 1921 Tulsa race massacre. Pretty powerful episode. So we're going to talk about that, about adaptation, about science fiction and the way you kind of can talk about how science fiction has always been used in many ways to talk about social issues undercover in some ways. So that's going to be this Thursday. And then I'll give you guys a little secret. I haven't told anyone this. We haven't announced this. We just booked it today. But Wednesday, that's the 11th, tickets will go on sale at 9 or 10 a.m. for an event with Ta-Nehisi Coates and Damon Lindelof, the creator of Watchmen and Lost and The Leftovers. Damon Lindelof, when he was coming up with the Watchmen show, read a piece in The Atlantic that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote called The Case for Reparations. And in that article, he learned for the first time about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And that was in some ways the spark that lit the fire that became Watchmen, which was so powerful if you saw it. So this is the first time I think they've done a conversation together like this. So it's going to be really special. And you'll get a copy of Ta-Nehisi's #1 best-selling novel, The Water Dancer, as well when you get a ticket for that. So that's this Wednesday. Share that wide. Tell your friends. You heard it here first. So a couple of years ago now, time is weird. I can't quite keep the timeline in mind in the COVID era, but we began kind of collaborations with PEN America. And if you don't know PEN America or what they do, PEN is an organization that kind of stands at the intersection of literature and human rights and protects free expression here in the United States, but all over the world. And so many writers that we've known and brought in have been part of PEN. And a decision was made to create 6 chapter cities around the country. And Tulsa was luckily one of the places that was picked. And I'm the leader of the chapter here in Tulsa. And, in some ways our work hasn't gotten fully going because we kind of were planning all these different things and had to kind of rethink about how we're going to do that. But I hope that in the next few years, we'll really begin doing some really intensive work here in our community, in our state. And it's PEN America Tulsa, but it's also in many ways PEN America Oklahoma, and also kind of regional and thinking about how we can impact that. Our guest today, Ayad Akhtar, is the president of PEN America. That's kind of the newest gig that he's gotten, but he has been involved with PEN for many, many years. And I got to meet him for the first time, I believe, at a board meeting that I attended for
Right.
Penn. But that's just one thing. We're here to talk about this amazing new novel, Homeland Elegies. If you don't know Ayad's work, we're talking Pulitzer Prize winning playwright, novelist, sometimes actor. I don't know. Do you play any professional sports?
No,
The
no.
list is unbelievable. So, but this novel, Homeland Elegies, is truly kind of unlike any book I've read in the way it's put together and the kind of blending it. We're going to talk a little bit about style and what autofiction is and how some of these things blend together and how you work with your own story and all these different things. But it's been one of the most acclaimed books of the year. We were just talking earlier. I think it's going to be on almost every best of list, and I think it will be pretty damn near to the top of those lists when they start dropping later this year. And couldn't be more thrilled to have him with us. So thank you so much for joining us virtually here in Tulsa.
Thank you, Jeff. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm sure, we're all singing the same song.
Yeah.
Got to live with the cards we're being dealt. So
Yeah, that's right. But hey, it's an opportunity as well. So
yeah,
congratulations on the book. First things, I mean,
thanks, Jeff.
I can tell by reading it when I got it. You were kind enough to get me an advanced reader, I guess this summer, and reading it, it has both the readability that you're looking for in a novel, meaning you don't want to put it down, but it also has a scope that I realized this thing was a major project that must have taken you, well, in many ways, your whole life to write because of what this is. You're known for of course, as a playwright, and your wonderful book, American Dervish, but this seems like you've taken kind of a new step into like a larger world. Can you kind of talk about
Sure.
what it felt like to take on this project?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me. It's good to be with you all. And I just, the political landscape, what was happening in our culture just seemed to, was combined with what was going on in my personal life. My mom had passed away and my father was sort of falling apart and ended up sort of dying as I finished the book. And there was, I think, an emotional intensity and tenor. And, I've been at this for some time. I've wanted to be a writer since I was 15 years old. I had a high school teacher who changed my life. And I've been working on my craft for a long time. And I think that all of those things kind of came together. The intense nature of our politics, what I'd been seeing going on in Wisconsin, where I'm from, what happened to my mom, what was going on with my dad, and then just the sort of acquisition of, just craft. I mean, all this practice over the years. And I suddenly had a language where I could actually do all of those things. I could marry emotion and thought and move freely across from, scene to social history to, philosophical discourse, whatever. They all kind of seamlessly moved in. I didn't have any trouble making them work and cohere. And it was the first time I was able to have that kind of freedom. So I think what you're saying is true. I think there's a larger ambition to this work than I've ever tried, but it's in part because the circumstances demanded it. The moment in our nation demanded it, and the no moment in my life demanded it, and I had a craft commensurate to the moment.
Before we get too far into this, I want to just remind everybody, if you'd like a copy of this book, and you certainly should, I can't recommend it more highly, I would encourage you to check out our chat. We have links to get the book right here. Also, if you have questions while we're talking, please throw those into the Q&A, and I'll try to incorporate some of those as we go, okay? So, talking about that scope, when people ask me what my favorite books are, and then if they ask me then, well, what is that about? That's usually the second question. If they have
Right.
I find that most of them I can't describe, and I always I do the reverse Seinfeld, and I say it's about everything.
Right. Right.
And in many ways, that's kind of a cop out, but in many ways, the best books to me are kind of about everything. And this falls into, I would say, that if that's a category, this falls into that. But the danger there, I think, sometimes is losing yourself in the kind of big stew that you're making, and everything starts tasting the same and everything. I'm just going to stretch this soup metaphor as far as I can.
It's working for me. So
Yeah.
it's okay.
I just ate dinner, so maybe that's part of it. But so how do you kind of then you have this thing, you
Yeah.
like I want to speak to the moment. That's a big idea.
Yeah.
But then how do you kind of start whittling it down?
I've been seeing a picture of this country for some time, a country divided between urban and rural and heartland and coast, between economic classes and between racial divides. And it was a picture that had been sort of gestating for some time. It wasn't something that had just come into being. The tensions that we're dealing with now are made so much worse by the kind of systems of polarization that the algorithms and the social media platforms, as well as our devices, are creating division almost the way that an engine creates exhaust. It's just part of the nature of the beast. But underneath all of that are very real tensions and very real dilemmas and problems. And to my mind, what I'd been seeing going on back home in Wisconsin was a kind of economic abandonment of the state, an economic abandonment of the heartland, an economic abandonment of basically our country. And that it had become acceptable somehow, ideologically, philosophically, it'd become acceptable, even celebrated, to sell off our national infrastructure, to sell off the ways that people made livings and kept their communities alive, to sell those things off in order to benefit individuals, to sort of make money. And that we'd enshrined this ethic of acquisition and accumulation of wealth and turned it into the sole value in American life. And that the only real thing that we could get behind, we legislated it, we idealized it, we elected a person, to the highest office in the land who espoused in every way some ersatz version of this ethic. And the rise of this way of thinking and being, to me, was something I've been thinking about for some time. I've been seeing the picture, and I was seeing how it had played out in my own family's life, and how my own father, who was a doctor, had navigated and negotiated this shift in the definition of what it meant to be American. That freedom and opportunity was ultimately the freedom and opportunity to prosper, to make as much money as you want. And at the end of the day, that can't be a definition for a country. We can't have a country where everybody's right to do whatever they want is the only thing that we're about. We can't just be about the freedom to have as many guns as you want, or use whatever bathroom you want, or make as much money as you want. There has to be some meaningful collective we. And so the gap between this we and the I, and the rise of this ethic of money, and I saw it playing itself out in my family. I saw the effects of it in my own career. And it seemed to me that the point of view of the things I'd seen from a familial level and in my home state of Wisconsin were a good way in to this much broader picture of what had happened to this country, and how we had landed in a situation where the politics were no longer even legible to us. We didn't even understand how we got here.
I remember growing up at some point, it's hard to pinpoint when concepts become ingrained in your head or whatever, but I remember being fairly young and having the sense that America was more an idea than anything else, that kind of central thing. And it felt to me like that was something that we all had. And then, of course, when you think about the history of American immigration, the concept of the American dream, I think, in some ways bifurcated, where the American dream for some people is like the picket fence and the job. And then
Yeah.
for the immigrant American dream, it's freedom and opportunity. And in some way, there was a moment where, to me, it felt like those split, and they've been on divergent paths ever since.
Hmm.
And we've done some events, some of our more powerful events. I've had, Layla Lalami and like Jose Antonio Vargas and some really amazing people here to talk about issues of immigration. And we always have, they really always end up, there are tears, and they're powerful, conversations that we have. And what I've seen and what I get to is that it seems the more we move away from that, the more that those two paths diverge, immigrants in some ways hold the concept of the American dream that we think of more than the average American now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And how do we reconcile those two things? It just seems, I don't know if that makes any sense to
No,
you.
it totally does. I mean, one of the questions that I get a lot is it has to do with American critique, like critique of America, and what the role of that is. And I constantly find myself pointing up the difference between generations, and that you have an older generation of Americans for whom the ideology of the American dream and sort of some of the higher falutin ideas about freedom and opportunity and the American way led to prosperity for them in their lives. And that some of those ideas now are repeated to younger generations, and they ring hollow. They didn't ring hollow for the older generation. They actually did mean something to them. But for the younger generation, sort of millennials and younger, just sort of say, well, that's not my experience of this country. I think something has changed. And I do think it's real. And I think it's something we need to contend with. It's harder and harder for people to get by. And when it's harder and harder for people to get by, they're going to be angry. There's going to be conflict. And maybe there should be, until the problems are addressed. And I think one of the challenges that I find going around talking about my work and talking about this book in some ways is that as a writer who comes from a Muslim background or Muslim American or whatever, born in this country, but to Muslim parents, and people want to hear some story about identity. And the argument of the book is that my identity did not prepare me to understand what has happened to the country. It's only once I sort of started to see the bigger picture, what was happening to all of us, not just folks who were brown or black or Muslim or whatever, that I started to understand what the real problems were and how we've landed where we've landed. So, I mean, I do think that the immigrant experience and the sort of white middle class and lower middle class experience are very different, but I think fundamentally we've got to address the concerns of both.
I was watching Saturday Night Live this weekend, and Dave Chappelle was the host. And I don't know if you saw his kind of monologue there, but at the beginning of it, there was a moment there that felt so. He said something that kind of I don't know, clicked a little bit of a light on for me. And he was talking about, in some ways, grievance, right? This grievance that we're dealing with, especially on that right side of the spectrum, white grievance. And he basically said, I'm paraphrasing him, if you feel a certain way, I've been there. If you feel this, kind of saying, I've seen this, if you feel this way. And he said, but the difference between you and me is that you hate each other for that, but I just hate that feeling. I don't hate people. I hate that feeling. That's where we could find the common ground, right?
Yes,
But
that's right. That's exactly right.
these forces have split us, right?
Yeah.
It's because in some ways the feeling we all have.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
It was really, I don't know, it just blew my
That's
mind.
exactly right.
Yeah.
So the book is about trying to get back to the feeling.
Yeah.
Trying to get back to an analysis of how this feeling came to arise. And, invariably, I'm going to have to tell that story through the perspective of something that I understand, which is my own experience, my rise, my struggles as a writer, my rise to some form of success, the experience of my parents, growing up in Wisconsin, all of those sorts of things, a life, surrounded by people with finance who work in finance in New York. And all of those things we're going to have to play a role in sort of trying to address and articulate the feeling that you're talking about. Because that's the essence. We are all feeling it. And yes, that's the difference, that he puts it beautifully.
Yeah, it was kind of mind blowing. It's like this articulated thing that you just never could quite put your finger on. So when you're doing a project like this, where you want to quote unquote say something about culture or whatever,
right?
It's easy to kind of get into the preachy mode. How do you kind of, how do you kind of avoid kind of, because you want, right? The ultimate goal is that you get the message subtly, right? The story comes first, the characters are first, and then if you take away something, that's kind of like the aftertaste a little bit, right? It kind of sinks into your head somewhat.
Yeah.
But it can be very easy to kind of push ideas on people. How do you kind of keep from doing that?
Well, I think all story is ideology on some level, right? So within a sort of we could say literary production of the last half century in this country, there's a certain ideology about what it means to show the transcendent and how one goes about doing that and how that is nested in the everyday and how the everyday is the reflection of that transcendent. And it's something about compassion or love, or the articulation of presence or awareness as experienced by a narrator or by a character, and ways to show that. So that's a whole system of representation, a story which a lot of people find resonant. And again, the same thing in this case, ideology. Yes, it's a picture of the country, but it's not a picture of the country that is necessarily Republican or Democratic. It's not a picture of the country that's inherently anti-finance or anti-business. It isn't pro-philosophy or pro-art. It's just an attempt to show or see more clearly the underlying forces that are creating a social situation. Invariably, I'm going to have some idea of what I think I'm trying to work toward. But if I stay connected to the process of just showing those things, people in their lives, the struggles that they're experiencing, and yeah, I point it in a certain way so that the reader thinks, yeah, I guess that there's some economic foundation to this feeling, that the feeling is coming from, the company Walmart moving into a community and 86 cents of every dollar being spent in that community, leaving that community, and in the process, killing all the local businesses, that what the effect of that big box store does in the community. Sure, I could say some nasty things about Walmart, but it's much more effective to just show the process. Everyone will come to the same conclusion.
Let's talk for a second about the structure of the book, and what it's like to kind of put yourself into the work, as it were. It's very blurry as to what's kind of real and what's not.
Right.
And, I think we're kind of redefining the novel a little bit these last 15 years or so. People it can be a little bit jarring to a reader, I think, sometimes when you're reading a work that you kind of are presented as novel and you think is fiction, but then you're like, wait a second, these characters have the same name, or this person has this. And I mean, we've been taught to do it. It's, Philip Roth did it. Everybody, it's been done a lot,
Yeah,
but it still can be kind of, I think there's the potential that it takes the reader out of it.
totally. I think it is taking some readers out of this book. I think that it's a battle that I wanted to have, it was a game that I wanted to play with the reader. And in part because I recognize that the collapse of the boundary between fact and fiction was one of the dominant sort of themes of our political reality. And also, one of the dominant modes of knowing now is the curation of the self. We spend so much time sort of curating the image of ourself for other people, whether it's on Facebook or any of the other social media platforms, that we are in a way kind of seeing the world increasingly through this lens of I. But the I is not some unmediated experience of I, it's actually a very mediated experience of I. And so that was, I knew would be part of the story as well, was this curation or this mise en scène of the author's life as part of what the reader is experiencing. I do think that art is not a corrective to reality, that it is actually a mimesis or a reflection at its best of reality. And so I wanted a book that had the texture of this kind of confused knowing about what's real and what's not real, as well as mediated through the self, because I felt that would express best the very dilemmas that we're dealing with. It was the best vehicle for that. So there is some confusion, and I never clarify it. I thought the earlier version of this book, I thought maybe I would pull a Operation Shylock or a kind of Counterlife. You mentioned Philip Roth. He's a huge influence on the book. I thought at some point maybe I would sort of signal with a very clear reversal toward the end what the game had been. Yeah. And I thought, you know what? It's not necessary. It's implicit in the culture now. There's no need to draw attention to it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And those books were brought to mind for sure when I was reading it in the best possible way. One of my favorite books is Blood Meridian.
Mine too.
And I love the way, for those of you who have not read Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, he does this little trick where he does these like few little words at the beginning of each chapter that kind of summarize some of the larger events in the chapter.
Yeah.
So you kind of would think like, well, he's giving away the events of what happened, but in some ways it just is a teaser. It's like the
Yeah.
ultimate teaser. You do a great thing in the here where you kind of put a chronology of events where you kind of could easily do that. I wasn't going to have you read anything, but I love
Jeff, that's inspired by Blood Meridian.
yeah. Oh, okay. There we go.
That's amazing.
Well, this was not pre-talk. We did not talk about this ahead of time for those of you watching. Could you read the chronology of events? I just like to see what that kind of feels like.
Sure.
To kind of get, because I was going to have you kind of do a larger summary, but I read this out loud to myself today, and it felt like I had read the book already, but still, it was just interesting. It's an interesting thing to do.
So this is what the chronology of events looks like, right? So it says in 64, 68, my parents meet in Lahore, Pakistan, marry, immigrate to the United States. 1972, I'm born on Staten Island. 1976, we moved to Wisconsin. 1979, Iran hostage crisis, mother's first bout with cancer, recurrences in 86, 99, and 2010. 82, father's first attempt at private practice. 91, father's private practice folds. He declares bankruptcy, returns to academic medicine. 93, father first meets Donald Trump. 94, dinner with my aunt Asma and reading Salman Rushdie. 97, father's encounter with final encounter with Donald Trump. 98, Latif Awan killed in Pakistan. 2001, the attacks of September 11th. 2008, family trip to Aptabad, Pakistan. 2009, car breaks down in Scranton. I think that's always a funny one. It's like the car breaking down is a major event in the book, which it is for those of you who read it, you know, but
it's there for a reason. That's there for a reason.
Yeah, it is. 2011, bin Laden killed. 2012, first opening of a play in New York City, meet Riaz Rind. Christine Langford and her unborn child die. 2013, awarded Pulitzer Prize for Drama. 2014, joined the board of Riaz Rind Foundation, meet Asha. 2015, diagnosed with syphilis. Mother dies. Trump declares his candidacy. 2016, Trump elected. 2017, sell my shares in Timur Capital. Merchant of Debt, a play, opens in Chicago. Father tried for malpractice. In 2018, I begin to write these pages. And I think if you've read the book, or when you read the book, it all makes perfect sense why those are the events that are there. But it is an odd thing to sort of like start the book off with these weird events.
I like the puzzle out. It kind of felt, I remember like in early COVID, we were all making puzzles. That was like what we baked bread and did puzzles. Remember those days? But it felt to me like I wanted to put those pieces together, which is why I really like that. I will ask you this: none of those are made up? That's all 100% true, right? Everything.
Oh no, many of those are made up.
Oh, okay.
It's interesting. It's been a fascinating ride. I'm not going to go into the details of what's made up and what isn't, but for starters, my birthday on that is wrong. I wasn't born in 1972. And so that's the first clue, that to somebody reading the book, if they have any interest in going a little bit more deeply. And I've been surprised by the journalists who make contentions in reviews and then don't actually do even a simple Google search to find out whether there's any truth to it. There was a reader on Goodreads who did a review, which was just fascinating to me. Said that he got to a certain point in the book, and I mentioned a professional athlete, a football player who gave up his career in the NFL to run for city council in Kansas City. And he says there's no such, he knows the NFL well, there's no such player with that name. Then he did all the initials of players that were well known enough. He said there was a Khalil Mack, but Khalil Mack is a Christian and he's still playing in the NFL. And that alerted him to the fact that maybe the rest of the book was made up, and started going through, and everything that would come up, he would Google. And he discovered about 20% of what was in the book was verifiable and 80% was not. And that he guessed that was probably the ratio of truth to fiction in the book. And it turns out he's right. It's about 2080. It's about 2080.
I just looked it up, everybody. Ayad was born in 1952. He just looks, he looks really good though for his age. So kudos to you on the moisturizers and whatnot. So, well, that's wild. See, that's the thing. I got kind of duped by that. I think.
Which is okay, because duping the reader is the only way that I can have the kind of intimacy. The intimacy of memoir is the only way that I can address and have the kind of passion about our country. If I was to write a third person narrator, and obviously first person fictional narrator, the events that I recount could only seem like satire at the end of the day, because our political reality has become so satirical. I mean, the reality of what's happening in the country has outpaced the capacity for fiction to even embody it, I think, on
Yeah.
some level. So anyway.
Was there ever a thought about having 9/11 be in 2002 just to really mess with readers? I don't know.
No.
Okay.
No, because that's the tricky thing, is to stitch. It's like, the French painting tradition called trompe l'oeil, tricking the
Oh
eye.
yeah, for sure.
Trying to trick the eye. The balance is trying to figure out how the space and the perspective of the wall that you're working with, also, the scale, and you've got to stitch all of those events into the texture of the historical reality that we all share, so that it feels.
It's kind of a literary con in a good way.
Exactly.
You're kind of a flim flam man.
Confidence man.
Confidence man. So I'm curious, what, it's not a memoir, but people in your
But it apes memoir.
But people in your life are mentioned, and
Yeah.
are part of the book. What's been the response from the people in your world? And did you kind of let them know, hey, this novel I'm working on is actually kind of not a memoir, kind of a memoir too?
There were just a couple of instances of people that I had to get in touch with. For the most part, the major figures, my father and my mother, are both no longer with us. So it didn't, that didn't factor. Beyond that, extended family, there's so many composited, everything that, the epigraph of the book is from the Alison Bechdel memoir, about something about my mother. It's about her. I can't remember what the name of it is. A brilliant book.
Are You My Mother? Yeah.
Are You My Mother? That's right. And in her sort of in that book, she says, I can only make things up about things that have already happened. So that's the epigraph of this book. Everything that is in the book in some way, shape, or form happened. It just didn't always happen in the way that I recount it. And so sometimes it didn't happen to the people that I'm recounting that it happened to.
Yeah.
So there is a substantial basis of fact in everything, but it isn't always, or it is almost never, 80% of the time, it's not the way that I relay it. So,
this kind of writing is certainly, it's somewhat in vogue right now with some writers, prominent writers writing what's called autofiction. It's kind of,
sure.
It's kind of the moment. Yours is different, I would say, than what like Carl Nosgard or somebody like Rachel Cusk or somebody like that's doing. But
Yeah.
But it is happening. About 10, 15 years ago, there was this huge scandal, right, where all these memoirists were busted for writing somewhat, but none of them were like 100%. The ratio on theirs was probably the same as yours is.
Might be, yeah. I just didn't want to get busted like James Frey, so I called it a novel.
I actually did an event with him last year, and it was kind of interesting. We talked about some of this stuff. We not in at the event, but we were kind of chatting and say, because he always contended that he wrote A Million Little Pieces as a novel first, and that the publisher wanted him to present it as a memoir. That's the contention here.
Huh.
And if that had occurred, in some ways, it would have been like early autofiction, right? It would have been kind of a. But it's interesting to see how we've kind of moved. I don't know if there's any trajectory from that period to where we are now.
Yeah.
Because I think in some ways it's almost impossible to write a memoir that could be 100% fact checked. I mean, how could you ever do that? Once you start throwing dialogue in there, it's already
fiction. It's already some form of fiction.
But do you see kind of any kind of through line from like how writing and memoir has somewhat changed over the last 10 years?
I mean, I think there's probably some really profound stuff for folks to say about all that. I'm not sure I could weigh in as deeply as I imagine some are. I mean, autofiction, contemporary sort of modernist autofiction does go back to Proust, and then earlier to Rousseau in a way with the Confessions. And there is a long tradition of this kind of process of staging the self or kind of narrating the self in a fictional setting, but that is drawn substantially from your own life. And I think increasingly folks, as I said earlier, the presentation of the self are mediating, they're experiencing everything through the lens of their own story. It's down to marketing and advertising, where you've got my cart and my account and my car, right? That the minus of my experience seems to be the dominant thread of people's sort of meaning of their lives. And so I think it makes sense that writers would lean into some flow, some intellectual and emotional flow that would resonate with readers in that way. I don't think of this book as autofiction, because I think of it more, to me, autofiction usually, you mentioned Rachel Cusk's work, or Nosgard, or more recently Martin Amis. Martin Amis may be a little bit closer to what I'm doing, in the sense that I'm not trying to, often with autofiction, there's a kind of inherent distance that the narrator has with the reader. They sort of posture that they are that person, but then they keep the events, or they keep the reader at just enough distance. It's almost like a reserve. But this book is trying to collapse that. In a way, it's trying to seduce the reader into engaging with it, almost like a kind of literary form of reality television or something like that. And with some of the sensationalist thrills of that. I wanted that, again, that was by design, because I felt that the diminishment of the reader's concentration, the inability increasingly, and I'm speaking of my own inability to sort of to deep read, really, to brook contradiction. There's something that's changing about our attention, and I wanted the book to be a literary book that could still engage with the reader in an immediate way that was more familiar to them because of the social media scroll or the breaking news notification.
Yeah. We were talking about the kind of the size and scope of this work, and kind of everything that you put into it. And it made me think about your fellow Pulitzer Prize winning playwright and Tulsa's own Tracy Letts, and his work, August Osage County, which, when you saw it and you saw the scope and the size of it and everything that was in it, you thought, like, this is something he's been working towards in some ways forever, and you would never want to kind of go back to that. I asked that thinking, is when you got done with this, did it feel like you'd kind of spent the things you wanted to get out of your system, and that you could kind of put it back on the shelf and go back to other things?
I think I told Alex Schwartz in the New Yorker that I had burned off a lifetime worth of kindling with this book. I've been gathering kindling for a lifetime, and I don't know what the igniting spark was, but the bonfire that resulted was this book. And I think all that material and all that stuff is gone. I would say it's been weird, Jeff. I feel like I didn't know that writing a book could change something inside me.
Mm-hmm.
Writing this book has changed something in me. It's consolidated something, or it's brought together or settled something that I didn't even know was looking to be settled.
Was that just the act of it being done and doing it? Or does that also include having it out in the world and being read, and some of the response to the book?
No, I think it was just the doing of it.
Yeah.
Of course, it's been gratifying. I mean, I'm overjoyed by the way that people are responding to it. But because it's a very challenging book in some ways. Yes, it's a lot of fun to read, but it's still kind of challenging in a lot of ways. And I couldn't have expected that people would embrace it with as much sort of open-heartedness and delight as they have. But that's not, somehow just finishing the book and writing it, that was the thing that had this effect I'm talking about.
Did you leave over some kindling for future projects? Do you worry about that?
I probably should be worried about that. I don't know. It's a weird thing. I'm doing some work for hire, and I'm writing a TV thing right now, and so I'm not really asking the question actively. But yeah, I wonder whether I'll be able to go back into this. I don't think I'm gonna retread any of this ground, but we'll see.
Yeah. I'd like to talk about Penn for a moment.
Sure.
You have been in this role, what, 6 months, maybe? Something?
Well, no, dude, they just announced I was going to be taking over in September. Jenny Egan, the president, until now, I've been working closely with her. I've been sort of vice chair of the board. So we've been doing a lot of stuff closely. I take over officially shortly, but I'm already in the process of sort of like doing a lot of fundraising behind the scenes and all of
Yeah.
that sort of stuff. So
So
it's a new role.
yeah, were you, you're taking for those of you who don't know, like I said, Penn does a lot of stuff in the area. My focus, of course, is a lot on the literary side, but there's so much that goes on in terms of litigation and free press freedom, and dealing with journalists who are imprisoned around the world. I mean, the legal side of it. When I came and got to spend a few days and really kind of do a deep dive up there with everybody and meet all the staff and kind of really get to know it, I had no sense of the scope of kind of the legal side of Penn.
Yeah,
Um, it's a lot of work. I mean,
it is.
and you having been, adjacent, board adjacent, being on there, what does that ask of you? Were you nervous to kind of step into that role, and kind of have the time commitment there?
Yeah, I was. I mean, I've seen Jenny do it beautifully for 3 years, and I've had front row seat to everything that she's done. I've seen how much time it's taken, but I've seen, I've in a way I've been prepared to sort of understand the various dimensions of the job and all of that. I'm excited. I mean, look, I'm excited to do it. I've met so many amazing people through Penn, and I feel like one of the things that I really do believe is that writers and literature can and should have a meaningful role to play in our national discourse. And I can't think of an organization that better embodies that yearning, that need for writers to weigh in meaningful ways at times when perhaps it's harder to be heard than ever before.
Penn in some ways seemed to reach a certain relevancy in the Trump era, right? That it's felt like it had, not that it hadn't had a purpose, but it definitely felt, and especially under Jenny's lead and all that, she
Yeah.
was so eloquent and outspoken about some of those issues, and but I wonder now that that's coming to a close, at
Yeah.
least, not that Trumpism is going away, of course, but how do you kind of think about that and positioning yourself and the organization in this kind of new era? Are you feeling hopeful? Are you feeling like maybe we won't have to kind of push against the tide so much, or the current rather?
Well, we're certainly going to have less chaos, and we're going to have less obvious, a less obvious antagonist when it comes to certain free speech issues, whether it's protest rights or any number of kicking journalists out of the press briefing rooms and yada yada yada. But I do think that the larger problem that we're all facing is one that's related again to something that I said earlier, which is the economics and the sort of growing conglomeratization, for example, of the news business, in which we increasingly don't have any sources of local news in many parts of this country. And when you lose local news in your community, you lose a way to know what the opportunities are, what the dangers are. You lose a way of making accountable your local politicians in their use of tax money. You lose the people who are going to help tell you what the story of the community is and build local identity. Those may not seem like obvious free speech issues, but they ultimately end up being free speech issues. Because if you don't have an environment where speech matters, then freedom of speech can't matter. So I do think that the much larger sort of issues that have given rise to the more obvious challenge of the Trump presidency are still with us, and they're only getting worse. The pandemic has only made corporate life and the corporate sort of order much more consolidated in terms of its power, and that's going to have huge ramifications for all of us when it comes to speech.
Do you feel that your term is a couple of years, right?
Mm-hmm.
You want to make an impact. Do you kind of view that as keeping, steadying the ship and making sure it stays there, or do you have something that you would like to actually do? Do you have an actual kind of wish list as far as things you'd like to accomplish?
I do. I have two major wish list things. One is to continue the initiative that led to the opening of the Tulsa chapter. I think that more Penn chapters across America are really, really important. I think that we are a nation profoundly divided between the heartland and the coasts. that wealth has been accumulated in the urban centers to the, at the expense of so much of this country. There are extraordinary thinkers and writers across America who I think are looking to find community with other like-minded, or not like-minded, but like-spirited individuals who think critically and deeply about life in America and life on Earth. And I think that Penn can be a good conduit for community in that respect. So I'd like to see Penn across America continue to grow. And then the other big thing that I'd like to do is to model, to have a, to encourage the other board members, the other writers on the board, to bring on more writers on the board who are excited about modeling literature and writing and writers as meaningful participants in our national discourse. And I don't mean just entertainers or advocates for points of view or celebrants of certain causes, but people who speak eloquently to the conditions that make up the dilemmas of our nation. I think that there was a time, the Mailers and Susan Sontags and whatnot, where there was a real presence, that the writing community had a real presence on the national stage in terms of shaping thought. And I don't think that we lack
the public intellectual, which is not a great term in a way. It's off-putting to a lot of people probably, but that's kind of what you're talking about a little bit.
And I think it's not that we lack for a quality of individuals to be able to play those kinds of roles. We just don't seem, they're not telegenic in quite the same way. A long sentence that's more than 140 characters that embodies a more complex thought is not an easy sell on Good Morning America.
Nuance is not sexy. Yeah.
We're living in the era of showbiz or entertainment as the model of thought, entertainment as the model of politics. And I think that in that environment, to be able to model critical thinking in persuasive, compelling ways, that to me would be a great contribution if we could find a way to encourage that more.
Well, I think that kind of speaks to, you look at someone like a Jon Stewart, or you look at someone like even a John Oliver, or even like what I was saying about Dave Chappelle. It's like using those platforms to talk about the idea that on Saturday Night Live, we were talking about those issues I talked about earlier, is not common, right? It's usually fart jokes and, it's like, or, somebody with a fake teeth or something. It's just like not that deep. But when you can do that, it seems to stick out because it's so rare, right? And maybe it felt profound because of the venue in a way. So I think you're right about that. As we wrap up here, I'm curious to know, one of the things that I find so fascinating about your work is the sense of, you growing up in Wisconsin, right? That seems to play a lot in the way you see the world in terms of income inequality, the kind of haves and have-nots, and the way that seems to always filter down. At the same time, you've had an amazing life. You've kind of had the best education. You've circled in the places that would be called the elites, right? You're elite adjacent over here, but then you have this background that's very much, it's like more Bruce Springsteen than maybe that's just your shirt that's making me think about that. But it seems like those two things put together in some ways is your true identity.
Yeah.
And taking those and speaking to both sides when you can. That seems to go through all of your work. Do you see a thread that you kind of are always taking? Maybe it's just you, I guess, and you finally figure that out with this book, that you in some ways are the messenger. But how do you kind of see the connectivity between all the work you do?
Wow, what a great question. What a big question. I think about my dad a lot, who's part of the book, and a portrait of my father. It's not exactly my father, but it's really very, very close to my dad in the book. And, the thing about my dad was he was a brilliant cardiologist. He was a man who was incredibly successful, and he was very much a sort of cultural elite in that regard. I mean, he was a specialist and an expert, and somebody who, made a lot more money than a lot of people do. But my dad always seemed to have some kind of feeling for the common man, if you will, for lack of a better, that was his locution. That's the way he would put it. It's what made him so good with patients. It's what made everybody that he worked with really follow, it was that he was a leader, and he felt that he was there was some sense of service to the folks that he worked with. It wasn't about benefiting from them. I remember, he ran a cardiology group, which was the largest cardiology group in the state. And I remember him telling me once how much money he was making. And I remember asking him, well, how many of the doctors in your group that you run make more money than you? And he said, well, about 60% make more money than I do. And he was the CEO. I said, well, Dad, why is that? He said, well, because I'm in charge. If I make more money than everybody else, then everybody's going to wonder what I'm really after. The only way that I can steward the interests of the entire group is to make it clear, because of what I'm also getting paid, that my interest is with everybody, not just with myself. And that was an innate way of thinking that he had. It wasn't like he was, and I think that in some sense, I saw that, I admired it so much. And there was something about the way that he talked about folks in our state, folks in our community, his patients. It just became part of my way of seeing the world, that, my neighbors' struggles were a part of my struggles, that they were, it was contiguous. It wasn't like we're doing okay, we're doing well and they're not. There was some way in which we were all in it together. And I saw that I saw that firsthand with my dad.
My wife jokes about this all the time, but the way I've kind of survived these last few years is I just endlessly watch Ken Burns documentaries over and over again.
Yeah.
I watch them the way that people chew Nicorette gum. Okay, like it's almost a habit. And I've watched the Roosevelt's one like 15 times. I don't know. I watch it all the time, and that's kind of, to get to the point, right? Someone like a FDR, right? Someone who's been given all these things, but somehow still was able to kind of connect with. And you know what's really fascinating about that? In a weird, bizarro world way, Donald Trump has done the same thing. Yep. And that gets to that ultimate thing we talked about the divergent paths, right?
Right.
They are in some ways the same thing, the same people, but the message is it's inverted.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. If these questions are fascinating to you, hopefully like these two nerds who are talking today, you're going to love Homeland Elegies. And I'm just rambling on. I could talk to you forever. So thank you for that. But if you guys haven't had a chance to get the book yet, please go to the link here and get your copy. It's a wonderful, wonderful experience. And you're going to want to talk to people about it and pass it around and give it to people for gifts and all those different things. But I just can't thank you enough for writing the book. And
thank you. Thank you for having me. This is such a pleasure. And I do hope I get to make it down to Tulsa when all this Michigas is over. So
we will do it. We will do it. Thank you all. And everybody take care and stay safe. And we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.